Welcome to Liverpool, and it's wonderful to see so many people from so many different professional backgrounds at our biggest conference ever. Let me start by thanking all our members for your engagement with EMIC over the last year, and make a special welcome to our students. We're expecting over 1,800 people here to attend the conference. We've got 37 different workshops that form the core of our learning program, and a new learning hub in the exhibition hall, which together represents over 60 events. We have over 10 publications, including a landmark Roads to Revolution report, which is available online now, and a great lineup of people for you to listen to and engage with. The future is now is a call to action for all of us to recognize that we need to embrace change. Today, we'll start by focusing on the main drivers of change in our world: technology and transformation. Tomorrow, we'll consider how the insurance world is responding to this challenge. And on Wednesday, we'll turn our attention to geopolitical risks. Conference is a unique opportunity to bring people together, to learn from each other, to share ideas, to innovate. Innovations driven by competition, of course, but also a recognized need, ideas and collaboration. Together we're stronger, and together we must lead the change that we want to see. EMIC is fostering innovation and embracing change. We're championing our risk and insurance professions. We're growing a more diverse and better educated membership. We're running more learning and networking events throughout the year, and with higher attendance levels. And we've set our course for EMIC's strategic development over the next few years. This year, we've welcomed Aviva to full partnership. Our focus with them will be on both employee benefits and the growth into the mid-market. Tokyo Marine Kiln, Mapfre, Belfor and Paragon have also joined our growing ranks of industry sponsors. We also welcome the institutes as our education partner, and we encourage everyone to look at their Associate in Risk Management, ARM, and ERM risk management qualifications, which have all recently been updated. And we welcome Fujitsu as our technology associate partner, which is of course so relevant to our technology and change themes here in Liverpool. We live in a world where success depends upon collaboration with ever more diverse stakeholders, and EMIC welcomes the opportunity to work with you. And of course, thank you to our partners for supporting and engaging EMIC and its members, for being willing to share resources, knowledge and insights, and for supporting us on our professional journey. Today, we're here to be alert to the constant state of change in the business world, and to work together to stay resilient, relevant, competitive, and successful. We're facing a tidal wave of technology-enabled change that will make us both disrupted and potentially the disruptor. We must embrace these changes, the opportunities and the threats they represent. As risk managers, we must wield genuine influence and care over the business outcomes for our stakeholders in this fast-moving and connected environment. We must be open to change ourselves. What works well now may well be obsolete in a few years' time. We must adapt to anticipate our members' needs. The commercial insurance market, in particular, has to ask how it will continue to be relevant to our members in 5, 10, or 20 years' time. The market's very good at insuring risks to tangible assets, such as property. But intangible assets now account for over 82% of a company's value. Businesses are also much more leveraged than they used to be. Products that only pay out years after an impact are much less valued than those that pay out in a timely manner. Cash flows need protecting. We need a big debate amongst the insurers, brokers, and buyers about how insurance can continue to play a central role in the risk management of our member companies. I don't suppose we'll come up with all the answers at this conference, but hopefully we can move things along and attract new members to our coalition of change. Ladies and gentlemen, it promises to be a great few days. Thank you all again for your support for AMIC by being here today. Have an enjoyable and productive conference. Thank you. I'm now going to invite Julia Graham, our Deputy CEO and Technical Director, to introduce our first session. The revolution is now.
Thank you very much, John, for that great introduction. I'm really delighted and privileged to have the opportunity to introduce an exciting new panel for this conference, which focuses on the digital age. But before I introduce that panel, I just want to draw your attention to our New Thought Leadership report, the Roads to Revolution. You'll find copies of the executive summary are available on the AMIC stand, and a full copy of the report will be on our website. I want to encourage you to have a look at this because there's some fantastic work in here which moves forward our previous thought leadership pieces, Roads to Ruin and Roads to Resilience. So it's natural that we take this next road. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors who work with us on this report, and that is FM Global, KPMG, Marsh, Russell Group, and Zurich Insurance. And also to thank our friends and colleagues, and especially Gianvito Lanzolla at Cass London Business School, and an advisory group of our own members who helped to steer this along the way. Now, our panel today will focus on the digital age and will be moderated by Spencer Kelly. Now, Spencer is not just a journalist. He lets slip that actually he also has a double first from Cambridge, and he's a doctor in technology. So he does actually have a deep understanding of the subject that he is going to moderate today. And he told me that he had a choice of being here today between Los Angeles or Liverpool, and he chose Liverpool. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our moderator for this session onto the stage, Spencer Kelly.
Say you want a revolution, well, you know.
Yeah, come in for that. There you go.
Thank you, Julia. Let's slip. I kind of wear it on a badge, I tell you. Hello, are you well? Excellent, brilliant. It's beautiful here in Liverpool as well. Los Angeles, also great, but I've been there a few times over the years, so I thought I'd give this a try. So welcome, my name is Spencer. I present the BBC TV technology programme Click, which you may have come across in the UK. We're actually an international programme. We're made for BBC World News. So if you have come across us, it's probably in some grotty hotel room and it's raining and we're the only English-speaking channel on. But we're paid for by BBC World, shown in the UK, and our job is to roam the world looking at the latest technology innovations, the biggest issues, and boy, there are some issues these days, and the latest scientific innovations as well. We're on every week of the year, and in fact, we've been on air every week of every year since we launched in the year 2000. So, this week we are putting together Season 1, Episode 945. So, if you're waiting for the DVD box set, it will be delivered by aircraft carrier. And I feel really lucky to do my job. I see some amazing things, and really, I see my job as looking at how technology is changing people's lives in countries across the technology spectrum, from the richest to the poorest, from the least developed to the most advanced. In fact, in a 1-minute nutshell, this is the kind of thing I get to do. Run that video, please. It really is. I'm very lucky to do this job. I get to play with amazing gadgets and meet great guests. I go to the hottest places and the coldest. And I've seen all kinds of things. at CERN, they threw me into the heart of the Big Bang. They sent me into space and lobbed me into the ocean. I've seen robots do amazing things. I've played them at ping pong. I've attacked them with weaponry. I've danced the Gangnam Style with them and been molested by a robot back support. But then I did put myself inside a Dalek, ride a giant robot spider, and yeah, I really must stop abusing the technology, really. Hottest wearable ever, wrist-worn flamethrower. Coldest shoot ever, filming the Alps in virtual reality. Most nerve-wracking shoot, smashing a glass bridge in China with a sledgehammer. And most eye-popping shoot, seeing an imaginary NASA Mars rover in augmented reality using HoloLens. Quick tip, if you are using augmented reality, do remember the objects that you can see aren't really there. But I do feel, amongst all of those gadgets, that we are really in the midst of a revolution at the moment. And it's not just about the gadgets or the autonomous cars or the smart assistants. It is one that involves big data and artificial intelligence and customers starting to vote with their feet and customer experiences. There have been a few revolutions over the last couple of hundred years: steam, transport, electricity, and each one has changed the world beyond recognition. Each one has created new, super powerful companies and laid waste to dominant companies that have come before them. And this technological revolution that we're in at the moment certainly has given rise to some strange new companies like Google and Facebook and Uber and Airbnb. And they all have certain things in common and maybe show us where things are headed. For a start, they seem to own nothing. As John said, intangible outnumbers tangible. Now, Airbnb doesn't own any hotels. Uber doesn't own any cars. So how have some companies built their businesses on seemingly nothing but the aspirations of their customers? And they attract these customers by building ecosystems and sticky customer experiences. So we know we all need to transform into digital businesses. Of course, not all of us will be this new type of business. We actually have stuff to sell, but that's not to say that we can't learn something from them. Now, crucially, these young companies all embrace risk in a very particular and completely different way. And there are many risks to being digital, not just risks to security and not just risks for your service being down and your company being offline. There are risks to reputation. There are risks of new competitors emerging from left field that aren't even technically your competitors. You know, Uber is a data company. It's not a taxi company. It just happens to use cars. So in the next hour, we're going to discuss some cases of digital transformation and associated risk management. Can I ask our guests to take their allotted seats here? We have 5 gorgeous guests for you today. Look at them in the darkness there. It's probably best if you see them in the darkness. But they all have different, I was joking, they all have very different perspectives on risk and transformation. And we're also going to hear the headlines from Emek's Roads to Revolution report that Julia mentioned. So, welcome. We're going to try a slightly different panel format to one that you might have seen before. Instead of hearing from them all in one go and then spending half an hour chatting afterwards, we're going to hear from each of our panel members. They're going to give a short presentation, and then we're going to discuss the points raised with the entire panel before we move on to the next subject. And we would love you to take part in this as well. So the best way for you to send your questions and comments to us is using Slido. Now, you can access that through the event app. So if you want to pull your phones out now, and if you've got the event app, click on the Slido option. If you don't, go to the website, which is slido.com. It's really simple. All you then have to do is enter the session name, which is AirMech 2018. And then choose the technology panel. Revolution is here, tech panel. All you then do is just type your questions in, and they will pop up on my screen, and I'll ask them at the relevant time. So slightly different approach to the age-old panel session. I really hope it works, because otherwise I'm in trouble. These are our speakers, slightly different from the brochure. We have Dr. Jamie Saunders, Professor of Crime. Brilliant title. Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who's leading the inquiry into the use of AI in the House of Lords. Professor Gianvito Lanzolla, he ran the Roads to Revolution report. He'll give us the headlines. Yvette Connor, a real person, a real risk manager to tell us what it's really like out there. And Richard Hartley, boss of Cytora, who uses AI to assess risk. Would you please welcome our panel? Dr. Jamie, you're up first.
Spencer, thank you. I'm going to talk about risk. I'm going to talk about the impact of digitization and technology. I'll say a bit about the risk itself, and then I'll talk a bit about the response. The key thing that I want to drive home here is that when one's talking about digitization, cyber risk, we're not just talking about what's happening inside the company. We need to think about what the internet revolution is doing to the economy as a whole and to society as a whole. And as professional risk managers, you need to think about all three of those dimensions. Now, at the company level, there's plenty of good guidance out there in terms of how to manage the risk to your own IT systems. I'm not going to go into that at all. There's plenty of help out there. I want to focus on the economy and society. Because at the economic level, there's at least three different ways in which this risk can impact. The first, of course, is that massive increase in interdependence that we see enabled by the digital revolution. And this manifests itself in very complex supply chain risks, for example. So it's not good enough just to be worrying about the functioning and security of your own IT. You need to be thinking about your supply chain, be that your IT supply chain or other critical services that you're dependent on. Now, there are companies out there, again, who can help you look at supply chain risks, but this is non-trivial because some of you will have hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of companies in your supply chain. The other impact of this technology is concentration. One could almost say a monoculture arising particularly in the IT industry, and there's many parallels perhaps with industrial agriculture and the fears there about dependence on a very small number of particular bits of DNA. Obviously, this creates concentration risk for the industry as a whole, but I think individual companies also need to think, how are you exposed, perhaps with lots of things happening at the same time to multiple customers that might create credit risk or whatever it might be. And then finally, we have the impact on the economy of the technologies themselves, IoT, artificial intelligence, Tim in particular, and we'll focus on that in the next discussion. I then want to talk about societal change. That is the key point. The internet isn't just changing business and the economy, it's changing people and society and how people interact. The most obvious example is how social media has completely destroyed any concept that when you're managing a crisis, you can manage a news cycle in that crisis. And you really need to look at your crisis management toolbook and say, can it cope when you can't control the news cycle? But perhaps more profoundly, attitudes in society are changing to privacy, to big data, enormous concerns arising about implications for fairness and equality, and again, that's something that Tim will be touching on. You've got a whole day on geopolitical risk, but the key point being is there's a lot of aggressive state actors out there, and they're making our lives harder, not easier. So the bottom line for you as risk managers is that you need to think about your models, you need to think about your risk registers, you need to take a very broad and holistic approach about that. That brings me to response, and the key message here on response is you cannot simply leave this to the IT department or maybe the security department to deal with. This affects every part of the business, and overall that risk has to be managed and owned at board level. Now, I'm going to advertise a separate report, I'm sure Ermic won't mind, but this booklet called Governing Cyber Risk, a Guide for Company Boards, was produced by the City UK and Marsh just 2 months ago. I was involved in helping to write that. And it looks at those key things which boards need to worry about. It's available on the internet. I won't go into it in any depth. But the key things which the board need to worry about, that you need to help them with, is how are they exposed to these risks? What kind of strategy is being adopted, and how can you move from a basically preventative approach to a preparedness approach? Boards need to think about where they're getting their assurance from. How do you know the people in charge of this thing are doing the right things in the right way? And finally, boards need to worry about how they're structuring the organization of cyber risk within their businesses and make sure they're not losing the key disciplines which you as risk managers are used to.
Bang, 000. Brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. Don't forget, you can contribute to the questions. Go to Slido AirMic 2018, and then put your questions in. We will moderate, and some of them will bobble up on my screen here. In no particular order, I want to start with the entire panel and just discuss, you talked about risk to reputation, being unable to control the news cycle where social media is concerned. Snap, the owner of Snapchat, yes. The share price fell because random celebrity, insert celebrity name here, tweeted that they didn't like the new interface. So that's one example. But then you look at Facebook, which has had a PR disaster in the last few months, and yet I get the sense that they move on. Is that the truth, and can we learn anything from how Facebook and those kind of companies manage this kind of risk?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually look back at some of the big news-grabbing cyber incidents of the last few years, and I'm thinking TalkTalk, the NotPetya virus last year, and so on, what really differentiates the companies that survive and the companies that have long-term damage is how they manage that immediate response to the incident, and in particular, how good they are at caring for their customers and other stakeholders. I think some of the companies I've named have actually did a pretty good job on that, and if you look at their share price, they've bounced back up. Others, it's hard to tell, and I wouldn't want to comment on Facebook, but it's too early to tell.
But in the immediate aftermath, I mean, if anyone has an opinion on this, please jump in. We're talking about the immediate aftermath. From my opinion, Facebook has that kind of approach. Whatever you think of Zuckerberg, he came out and said sorry, whether he meant it, he came out and said, yeah, we've made mistakes. And that I watched that as a journalist and thought, wow, that's really unusual. Because most of the time it's prepared statement, not accepting blame and stuff. So what does the panel think about?
I think he's actually come across as much more arrogant than just, you may have thought it was pretty amazing that Facebook gave an apology, but he actually came across as extremely arrogant. But, they published record results very shortly afterwards. So there is a paradox there. And I think, as Chow En-lai said about the French Revolution, it's too early to say in the way that Jamie did. We don't know how corrosive that is going to be for their corporate reputation, for their consumer reputation. At the moment, a lot of those young consumers are actually reconsidering whether or not they're going to stay on Facebook. And I personally know a lot of people, of an older age group who are certainly deleting their accounts. So actually, we don't quite know yet.
Okay, cool. Richard?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point around the kind of hierarchy of needs. In a sense, companies like Amazon or Google or Facebook, they're definitely monopolies, but they're also fundamental to how people live. So in my kind of age bracket, which you can kind of say, millennials and people who are older, Facebook is so fundamental to how they interact, how they build trust, how they communicate, that is probably more important than a reaction to a kind of a transgression or something that contravenes standards. I think another example of this is Amazon Prime. I think its penetration in the US is around 70%. So 70% of Americans buy a product from Amazon Prime. It's hugely embedded, and the sunk cost of saying, we're not going to use Amazon is huge, that there's no substitute. So I think there is a question around what your choice is as a consumer. You don't have price, you don't have competition, you don't have substitutes, it's not fungible.
So unless you are in that monopoly situation, you can't take the risk of doing handling it in the way
exactly.
I was just going to say, but companies can be incredibly arrogant, because Kodak was in a monopoly situation just about. Fujifilm was much, much smaller. So, the higher you fly, the further you fall.
I'm going to take a question here. Thank you very much. How much of a cyber threat is Russia to the Western digital business? Didn't take us long to get there.
Pretty significant.
Pretty significant?
Yeah, hugely significant. NotPetya, our government has said, was a Russian operation. It was massively, massively disruptive. I think the worry is that the normal rules of behavior you'd expect of civilized states don't seem to apply to deadly poisons in Salisbury and running amok on the internet. That's extremely worrying, and any risk manager who thinks they can ignore that is wrong.
And it's not just sort of data leaks, it's much more active than that. It's fake news, it's the impact on presidential elections, the Trump election, it's the impact on the Brexit referendum and so on. So it is not just hacking, it is far, far more pernicious than that.
Okay.
As the sole American on here, I will wade into this one
Good luck.
cautiously. I think that when we look at the risk that Russia brings to this particular conversation, the headline that is often discussed is what's happening in Ukraine, which has essentially provided them a laboratory to do many things unchecked, with an ability to develop various weaponized strategies, which can then be deployed in other channels. And that in and of itself, that laboratory, if you will, provides a significant breeding ground for a lot of the 0 days and the various sort of attacks that we are seeing in our country. And I know other countries reflect similar views. So whether we talk about elections and fake news and what have you, I think that's all certainly relevant and important, but the bigger question is the militarization of what it is that could emerge as a result of the risk. Secondly, following on the Facebook comment, although we do see bounce back in stock prices, we also regularly see what I call the wobble. And the wobble says that after the bad thing happens, in a reputational crisis, if you will, that we may see the stock recover. And we've had companies such as Target in the United States, which has gone on to become a substantial case study, and Sony, of course. But what we see is that the stock prices of these companies never resume a level of firmness, and that volatility actually costs those companies money. And a big part of what we do in risk management, those of us that wear the risk management hat, is I think we really pride ourselves on removing that volatility or reducing the volatility. So therein lies a conundrum for us to solve. And then last but not least, the biggest part about what happens, I think, with the Facebooks of the world and others, is what I would call a secondary effect, and that's the emergence of new regulation. So even if they just get the hand slap or the apologetic mea culpa in front of US Congress in this case, what we often see is we see now the US Congress saying, we need a GDPR sort of law. And so for those of us that are, quote unquote, watching the regulatory frontier, this is where we see the action.
I absolutely agree with that. Can I just mention competition?
Please, yeah.
I mean, certainly we're seeing increased kind of monopolization of data, which regulators are waking up to. And that's a classic example of where, Congress, where EU, Commission, and so on are going to be looking, I think.
Okay. There is a saying in Silicon Valley that do it and apologize later. And that's what they follow many of these companies. But there is a limit, and the risk for Facebook and Google and the likes is not that much that technological, because they built such a huge install base that is a quasi-monopoly, but it's regulation. Yeah. I mean, they're pushing the boundary a little bit too much. In fact, I mean, one also of the findings of the report is that there is tension between compliance, something that can be done by ticking the boxes, but longer-term legitimacy of the company, and that's where, I mean, they are getting into uncharted territory. It's really risking.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on now to the subject of artificial intelligence. If you have questions for Lord Tim, then please get on Slido as you hear what he has to say. The senior lawyer who's leading the inquiry into the use of AI for the House of Lords, not the use of AI in the House of Lords, the use of AI to give to the House of Lords.
We need more AI in the House of Lords.
No comment. Over to you, sir.
Spencer, thank you very much. And I really want to talk about the context, the political context, for where I think the corporate risk radar should be directed. And of course, we all, in a sense, have to navigate between the extreme negativity, the pessimism of people like Elon Musk, who calls AI more dangerous than nuclear weapons, and the extreme optimism, perhaps lacking credibility nowadays, of Mark Zuckerberg. But we, I think, navigated a realistic course. So we rather more agreed with the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, who said that AI is more profound than electricity or fire. And in the sense, he was talking about it as a future utility. And indeed, one of the slogans here is the future is now. Indeed, AI is already with us in so many ways. We have Amazon's Echo, Echo Dot, Google Home, Siri, Alexa, and so on and so forth. So we have a huge variety of AI already present with us. And we recognize that as part of our Select Committee report. We recognize that what we were having to do is not just simply treat this as some sort of futuristic technology that we needed to think about. This was here and now, whether it was in the form of weak AI rather than strong AI. And nevertheless, we looked at a number of different strands. And we looked at, in particular, the impact of AI now and in the future. We looked at the potential opportunities presented by artificial intelligence, particularly for the UK, and we looked at the possible risks and the implications of AI. In particular, how the public should be engaged in order to maintain public trust. We were very conscious that the GM Foods situation was not a public communication or an attitude of the public that we wished to replicate. And then finally, what were the ethical issues and how were we going to talk about an ethical framework? How were we going to suggest an ethical framework, in particular, to mitigate some of those risks? And there were 5 strands, really, to the report. First, how we ensure we stay as one of the best places in the world, in the UK, to develop and use AI. And I'm not going to go through all the different proposals, but in particular, there were these issues about competition to make sure that access to data was achievable by smaller business, not just by the tech majors. The second thread, very importantly, related to how we equip people for the future. We accepted to some degree some of the forecasts for job losses. We thought some of them were over-egged, but even on a precautionary basis, it was really, really important to make sure that we were prepared for those job losses in terms of reskilling, and that we understood much more about the jobs of the future, because at the moment, that is a little bit of a black box, even as far as policymakers are concerned. So retraining, really important. But broadly speaking, one of the most important things is just plain digital understanding, so that people do understand the impact of technology on their lives. Third thread, individuals need to have much greater personal control over their data and the way in which it's used. That, of course, is very much highlighted post the Cambridge Analytica situation, and it does mean establishing concepts such as open data, ethics advisory boards, and data protection legislation, perhaps going beyond even the GDPR. And transparency, of course, is the essence of that in terms of use of algorithms and so on. Fourth thread related to diversity and inclusion, in particular, making sure that when we design these systems, we're not simply replicating the prejudices of the past, and we don't inherently incorporate bias into those systems. Fifthly, and perhaps the most important thread, because it ties all the others together, is we must have an ethical approach to AI. First of all, voluntary, but then actually incorporated in the work of our regulators. So the use of ethical frameworks, very important, needs to be international. Business, boards, they need to be cognizant of those ethical frameworks that are being proposed. Ours, we don't have a monopoly of wisdom. We do want that to be rolled out on an international basis. And we believe that will be absolutely crucial in mitigating any lack of public trust in AI in the future. So we think that the corporate world needs to take full account of that framework.
Thank you very much, Tim. Questions again on Slido. Thank you for the ones that are coming in so far. I want to start with the question of transparency, which is something that you recommend, that these artificially intelligent algorithms, and indeed all algorithms, are transparent enough so if something goes wrong or something is not correct, the regulators maybe can go in and at least see what went wrong. I'd like to ask the panel in general, is that realistic? Because the algorithms, the AI that all of these big companies use, and indeed you might want to use as well, that's your secret sauce. That's the thing that makes Google so valuable, is that its algorithm for ranking, for example. So do we think it's realistic that we can have any kind of transparency?
Let me just unpack that before other people come in, because what we weren't arguing that you needed in every case to actually unpack precisely how the algorithm works.
Right.
You have to be appropriate. If it's an absolutely life-changing situation, like whether or not you go to jail, there's some of the Florida evidence, you have to know what data sets are used, and you have to be able to audit whether there are inherent biases in that data. And the same is probably true of certain crucial financial services decisions. But what is not the case is that you expect Netflix, for instance, to unpack its algorithm because it's telling you that because you like that movie, you're going to like another movie. You have to be proportionate, and therefore you have to insist where the really crucial decisions are made, that transparency is designed into it, particularly in terms of why those outcomes were achieved.
So the panel, do we think that's realistic when we're talking about governance, or whether we're talking about life-changing things? Jamie.
Well, I'll comment. I mean, my background is policing and intelligence and all that sort of stuff, and that's all about transparency and public consent in what is fundamentally a secret environment. And I don't see why the same model can't apply in the corporate sector. If you can't have complete transparency directly by the public, then you have to have some kind of trust by proxy, some kind of ombudsman service, or some sort of oversight where they're allowed into the secrets but are trusted with that, but can still look after public interest.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think as a kind of design principle and from a philosophical point of view, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think there's also a kind of practical point of view. Can it be done? And a lot of the algorithms which produce, for example, the ranking of Netflix. So when you sign up to Netflix, you get a list of films that are recommended for you. That happens because you're placed into maybe one of 100,000 different clusters. Kind of saying you're like these other people, therefore you will like The Sixth Sense, for example, as a ghost film. It's hard for Netflix to explain why that is, because they're using features that are hard to communicate. And a lot of these features, you can think about them as rating factors in the insurance industry. A lot of these kind of rating factors they're kind of non-linear, so they're just like numbers. So there is a kind of trade-off between probably the precision of the technology or the artificial intelligence and any ability to interpret it. I don't think that's a kind of categorical trade-off, but that relationship probably does directionally occur.
Okay. I just want to squeeze in another question, which is about jobs. We talk about automation will replace jobs, but then we kind of counter that by saying, but new jobs will be created. And I always think, but not as many jobs, because you can replace 1,000 call center operators with maybe just AI and then 4-5 supervisors. So are companies ready for the inevitable?
If you look at the curve since 1900, of course, the way that services took over from manufacturing, and you look at the introduction of quite a number of the new technologies, okay, so there were far less horses, but there were many more motor cars. So I'm not as pessimistic as the Frey and Osborne figures, and they go up to about 47% of all jobs being lost. I do believe, though, that certain areas, the professions, I think, are going to be quite heavily hit in the, if you like, the less skilled, younger ranks, and that is going to be a training problem. I think one has to look at some of these particular areas and say, where do we think the real impact is going to come?
And very briefly, is the onus on employers to keep retraining their staff? Yvette, you're a real person.
Last I checked.
Does the onus fall on employers to actually have this lifelong learning, this retraining?
I'm not entirely sure of that answer. I would perhaps reframe the question a little bit differently in the sense of where the opportunity lies to grow the business and drive value for the shareholders. Because that usually is the overarching mission and purpose, at least of a publicly traded organization or a healthcare organization focused on its community, for instance. So I think the question becomes, how do we do better for them? And if the answer is that we can provide a safer product, and we might be using artificial intelligence to do that, a more resilient product, more of a product, then they will look at ways to optimize that. I don't think that suggests that they're setting the workforce to the side. I think what it suggests is that they'll look for different types of workforces that will naturally emerge as those workforces reply to a demand for them. I think it is incumbent on today's universities, who I know are acutely focused on this, to think about what does that workforce look like. So I would argue that the answer comes from two places. One is the motivation and interest of our up-and-coming students to do something that ultimately the future will welcome them to do. And two is for the universities and our technical schools to provide the relevant training for them to do it. Then I think employers, back to the business prospects, will embrace it wildly.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on because now we're going to hand over to Gianvito. Gianvito is the Professor of Strategy at Cass Business School, City University of London. You ran the research that contributed to the Roads to Revolution report. So Gianvito, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to stand up. You will not notice the difference. But anyway, it's better like this. Also because I will have to point to some of the slides. I have been given this autonomy to present some slides. So yes, thank you for the introduction. This report that you will be seeing on the website builds on a research that has going on for 1 year, and I'm going to give you some glimpses out of what we found. So, I mean, I think in 5 minutes I can just give you a few things, just a few bullet points. The first, so the idea of this report is try to understand what are the business transformations that are triggered by digital technologies. So there are plenty digital technologies, AI, Internet of Things, big data. I mean, you can frame, reframe, call them in many different ways. Now, we have looked at the whole spectrum of technologies, and we have done several cases and also a systematic review of whatever it has been produced in the business and academic literature. And so what we have found, I mean, it's to some extent can be let's say, summarized in this table. So on the on my left-hand side, you find some strategic evolution trade-offs. So what we find in this report is that because of the increasing adoption of digital technologies, companies are moving more and more from ownership of technologies to access to technology. This creates a risk that goes beyond the technology, the technology risk narrowly described as not having the possibility to do, for example, your invoicing. Because once technology goes at the core of your organization, once technology performs the functions, doesn't only enable the function, if you lose technology, you lose your organization. So here it's something much more than cyber risk. It's just a business risk related to technology. The second is the more you use AI, the more you use big data, the more you move your organization into data science versus experience and science. That was a very revealing case that I did with the Met Office. I mean, they have used a lot of big data, but now increasingly have to bring back into their organization scientists because quite simply they don't know how to interpret all the data that they have in their systems. And this created this black box risk that, I mean, we were already hinting before, which is a massive risk that we need to try to cope with. I'm going to go briefly to the other risk. I mean, digital transformation requires a lot of experimentation. We don't know really exactly how things will shape out in the future, so we need to experiment a lot. Now, boards don't like very often experimentation. They like more stability, predictability, de-risking the company. Now, this is a massive, massive problem because there are several levels of lags that are created in the organization. I'm going to show these lags with this slide. So what we find is that you can see the yellow circle, the orange, and the blue. So the yellow is the external environment, the orange is the strategy level, and the blue is the operation level. These clocks are running at completely different speed. So there is a massive lack of harmonization across pace of change in the external environment, pace of change in your strategy, and the way in which you build resource capabilities. Quite basically, put it bluntly, often risk managers end up being focused on the blue part, so looking at things that are maybe doing perfectly well their job, but a job that simply doesn't reflect any longer what is the strategy of the company. And there is plenty of evidence in the cases that we have developed. So back to the risk, another big risk that is related to AI, especially AI, is that, I mean, the more you adopt AI, the more you go for optimization, for efficiency, which is beautiful, board will like it, bottom line will be fantastic, but you lose slack. You lose slack and diversity. There is a massive risk there, which we already hinted, about concentration in fewer and fewer assets. So start thinking about the implication for the risk profession. Do we have tools and frameworks and practices and processes that are attuned to all this risk? Now, we have already spoken about the need of being open, so much open, companies will have to become more open. This creates the need for knowledge integration, so going beyond your legacy knowledge domains, rather than being specialized in your domain. This is a massive cultural change. incentive change. There are plenty different layers of change that this trade-off triggers. And I mean, one way of putting it is the blurring of organizational and firm boundaries in the organizations. Very quickly, last one, control versus openness. This is the connected risk, which basically propagates everything that you do in one part of the world, everywhere else in the world. So now the connected risk basically undermines the very foundation of the fallback assumption, which is at the core of many risk management practices and tools. I'm running out of time. I'll just show you that, the report has plenty of implications for risk professionals. In a nutshell, for risk professionals, the most important thing that is we should be going outside in rather than inside out. Risk professionals have to become more and more strategic. And I think, as a point of discussion, the latest ERMIC report survey asked to you, when you adopt AI, do you think that AI will be perfect and will never let you down? Now, this was a kind of provocative question, I must admit, a little bit cheeky. 40% of you said, no, basically perhaps fall into the trap to answer, AI will never let me down. So it basically means that 40% of us believes that once we bring AI into our organization, everything will be perfect. That's not the case, as we have already learned. So many things will happen, many things will have to be discussed. There are also plenty of implications for the boards, and I'm going to summarize in one word. Dealing with digital transformation is not only about cyber risk. That's very important. It's absolutely important. It's mandatory. But there are plenty more of risk that the board has to grapple with. And perhaps the most important one is the tension between compliance, which is short-term, and long-term legitimacy, which is what we have been discussing earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianvito. I know there's a lot to squeeze in there. So just a couple of minutes on this. Your report talks about the need to encourage creativity within a company to be able to redesign processes quickly, to reinvent your purpose, and all the while being able to retain stakeholders while you reinvent yourself. Yeah. Simples. Does anyone have any comment? That sounds like a really tall order. Does anyone have any comments on that, Tim?
One of the things that actually slightly surprised us was that even all the computer science experts, all the AI experts who gave evidence to us, they emphasized the value of the humanities. Yvette was talking about our universities and so on, and what they need to do to prepare. This is not purely about computer science. It is about creativity, and therefore, and problem solving, and all sorts of other skills. It is not just simply making sure that our secondary schools are full of people who've done coding and computer science and so on, because AI is going to be augmentative, is going to work alongside us, and that is going to be one of the key features.
It's kind of got a bit higher level than just the coding now.
In fact, in our MBA, what we are doing is just taking everything that is commodity, but then empowering our students to connect the dots, to go beyond everything that can be automated. So the key differentiator for CAS is, I'm speaking for CAS, but all the other business schools, they are trying to identify those areas that cannot be commoditized, which is basically connecting the dots across things that were once disconnected.
Yes.
Yeah, I think an interesting proxy here is where are the top graduates of the world going? What sectors are they going into? Maybe 20 years ago, you said a lot of people went into management consultancy, hedge funds. Now everyone, not everyone, but the kind of dominant change is going into technology companies who are paying the highest salaries. They're offering the most kind of ambitious and interesting projects to work on. You can also look at what companies constitute the FTSE 100. What are the most valuable companies in the world? Most of them, the big changes have become technology companies. I think, the top 5 most valuable companies, I think 4 out of 5 are technology companies. So it's hard to imagine a company in 20 years' time that doesn't have AI, big data as a fundamental part of it, being a dominant company. And I think from a risk management point of view, there's definitely a big risk of not investing in a nascent technology like AI and becoming kind of obsolescent as a result of it. I think that's a massive risk. And the cost of starting a company, and this is my perspective of having started the company 4 years ago, the cost of starting a company has declined almost to zero. It's incredibly cheap to start a company. You don't need to fixed assets.
Does that mean the competitors for everyone in this room could turn up tomorrow
Yeah,
in a bedroom or a garage?
Well, definitely, especially when you think the competitors will be technology companies. Every single sector in the world is becoming embedded with technology. So if you're not investing in technology and accepting there is a level of risk to it, I think there is a kind of paradox about how you can still have ambitions to be in the place you are. So I think there's an interesting relationship between taking risk and managing risk. You want to take risk because you have to be innovative, but you want to manage risk because you ultimately, you don't want to kind of contravene what's acceptable in today's standards, but that is important.
Thank you. We're going to hand over to you, Yvette, now. This is Yvette Connor, ex-insurance, now Chief Risk Officer at Focal Point Data Risk. So this is hopefully the perspective, as I say, from someone who's actually trying to implement these things and watching these changes happen. Maybe you can explain what Focal Point is just for a few seconds, and then over to you.
Sure, we focus on technology risk management topics in a nutshell. So we think about everything we've been discussing in this panel daily. And I think that, from my perspective, what we're talking about up here is really, I'm going to sound a little bit contrarian, but perhaps no different than what risk managers in the audience have been doing for years, if not decades, which is you're in the business of identifying risk, you're in the business of qualifying and quantifying risk, and you're in the business of measuring and reporting risk. But now what you have before you, arguably, is one of the most exciting, challenging, ever-changing risks that you might face in your professional career. And to the arguments and discussion points that you're hearing today, requires a new approach, not a new approach in risk management, perhaps a new approach in terms of your lens that you apply to the risk management framework. When I'm in front of boards, including our boards, I regularly hear three questions. And it's very consistent. I often say 99, which is a high percentage, and those of you that are in the same field are nodding and saying, that's high, be careful. But that's how certain I am of this answer. And the three questions are these. The first question that you'll hear from a board is, are we at a material risk of an issue? And so as we think about artificial intelligence and the role of large data, including embedding it into our product and our delivery models, the question becomes, are we at a material risk of a compliance deficiency? For what? What's the potential impact that could drive to that deficiency? The second question is, do we have a good lens on our technology risk profile? And they'll ask it just like that, without any defined terms. They're not going to define technology, and they're not going to define risk profile. But since you are the CRO or risk manager, they expect you to generally know what that means. So they're going to lob that question to you. Send it over the wall, if you will. What is the risk profile? And what they're often looking at there is, how do we get bigger, better, smarter, drive value for the company, optimize technology the way that you're describing, and ultimately drive to outcomes that are going to help us in a sustainability, an efficiency, and a productivity manner. And that's where risk management, to your point, can step up and become strategic in the decisions. And then last but not least is the one that I guarantee you most of the folks in this room are well versed in, which is, are we insuring any of this risk? How much are we insuring? What are our retentions? Does our coverage match our risk profile? And more importantly, perhaps, in the event there is a material compliance deficiency, does our coverage capture that as well, a la GDPR? So this is what we regularly see. These are the practical questions that move to the heart of the aspirational statements that we just received about what good looks like in terms of our role and how we should be strategic. But we have a functioning day-to-day obligation to get in there and diagnose, identify, quantify, measure, and report, just like you've been doing for decades, if not years. So now the question becomes how? How do you look at this technology risk assessment? How do you turn it into a meaningful answer for your business? And then ultimately, how do you look at it through the lens of insurance? And I want to go back to a point that was made about regulation earlier. This is one of the biggest challenges that I see that we face is the rate of regulation, sometimes slow and plodding, sometimes fast, and how rapidly the insurance market responds to some of our creative needs in the face of the regulation. You can tell us that we need to be more creative. Raise your hand if any of you in the audience believe that insurance companies move especially quick in innovating those new products for you. Are there any hands up? I've got bright lights in my eyes, but I don't see a whole heck of a lot. So this is the conundrum, right? You have an emerging risk that's coming at you very fast. You're going to apply your risk management principles to it. You're going to accept the challenge to become more creative. You're going to look for workforce and members of your team who understand and can engage in a meaningful way. And then you're going to look for insurance products that can step up and answer some of the critical questions. So that's how we put it all together. And I would leave you with this piece of advice. One of the biggest challenges about technology risk are these unintended consequences. And I wanted to share an example because it's very relevant in the role of risk management. I was recently working on something with a large organization who's targeting millennials. They want to sell to millennials. And they noticed something interesting about how millennials bought their product, which is the rapidity at which they want to execute the trade. Very quickly, they want to know it's done well, and then they want to move on to the very next thing. I am talking life insurance in 5 minutes or less as an analogy. Now, imagine that there were only 3 vendors in the world using some pretty sophisticated machine learning AI technology that you can actually go and buy to leverage into that business model. So now you as the risk manager are called into the room and you're asked to be creative. You're asked to assess that risk and you're asked to help mitigate that risk. Well, what if the answer is all 3 of those vendors do not rise to the standard of care of your risk governance framework, your controls, your risk tolerance, and/or your appetite? Now what? And this is the unintended consequence. It's this: incentives matter. And if the risk management framework that exists doesn't evolve in some meaningful way, we are going to see lines of business who want to hire that vendor because they're going to be compensated on the growth of that business, circumvent our risk management processes. That's what's going to happen. So this is why we have to keep pace. We need to be able to be in the board meeting or at the audit committee meeting or at the digital transformation committee meeting and have that discussion in a meaningful way, to your point, about accepting a level of risk that's appropriate for the business, subject to what it is we're actually talking about. That's the real opportunity to be creative, to be strategic, to talk about compliance, and to understand that you're going to have a big unintended consequence if you try to put the brakes on things that businesses are heavily incentivized to do, a la procuring millennials as clients, and yet unable to, quote unquote, satisfy a risk and compliance mandate. Therefore, the consequence is they'll circumvent it.
Okay, thank you, Yvette. I'm going to go straight to a question from Slido here, which is about creativity. It's what we've been talking about. How can legacy companies change the culture to encourage creativity, which is one of the big questions. So general thoughts on that. And also whether, Yvette, you've seen any kind of talent adjustments that you've seen made in the companies that you deal with. But the question of creativity first. How do you do it? Do you hire, I think Richard on the briefing call, you said some companies just hire someone with a beard and think it's done. But
I mean, it's not Van Gogh. I mean, it's not this kind of romantic idea of creativity. It's just basically understanding that innovation can come from connecting the dots. I mean, the new innovation paradigm is exactly this. It's the one of recombination. So it's about opening up, so seeing the world with the broader eyes, with the broader, having a broader view on the world. So that's the kind of training. It's not necessarily creating a new masterpiece. It's not that romantic thing.
I think some of this is actually diversity. It's about making sure that when you hire people, you have a mixed group of people. You know, it isn't just the old conformist type of culture. And I think that's really important because it's by putting different cultures together, different ideas together, that you come up with new ideas.
And it's also,
you know, so you can engineer it. And it isn't just a question of having incentives and so on and so forth. It's how you construct the teams, I think.
It's the framework within which you operate, which is basically, there are plenty of practical tools, design thinking, you can do plenty of things. But the underlying philosophical change is exactly this, diversity. In fact, one thing that we have to explore is the new dimension of diversity. Because, I mean, everyone speaks about the usual gender, nationality, age, but there are new dimensions in terms of culture, in terms of legacy domains. where you start from pharma, from computer science, putting this almost anthropologically different people together can create that creativity that we are looking after.
We allow the odd beard as well. You know.
The odd beard never goes.
I'll give an example. If you have not recently sat down with the DevOps teams in your business, I would encourage you to have a conversation with them. Now, if you don't know what DevOps is, that's step number one. Figure out what DevOps is. These are the folks that are writing your web-facing application, the internal code that might be running various technology systems within your business. Why should you have a chat with them? Well, because they're actually very interested and have approached a group of risk managers such as myself because they're practicing diversity and creativity. You have coders, former hackers, coming to risk management folks saying, when I write code that does this, this, or this, what else should I be thinking about? How do I understand risk contextually as I create a product? So why not insert yourself, pursue that diversity, and insert yourself into that equation? They are hungry to learn about how they can be part of the governance framework, and ultimately, they're a big part of the governance framework. And so that would be one example I could cite.
Thank you. And just a question here on big data, which says, why are we not doing more to make the case for big data and the advantages or benefits it brings to businesses and customers rather than focusing on the risks? And I would ask, on top of that, how you gather the data needed to assess the risk for insurance.
So, really good question. I think just to connect this to the previous question, the fact is when you invest in any new technology, you don't know the risks associated with it at that point in time, and nor do you know the performance. And that's exactly what a venture capitalist will tell you. They invest in 10 companies, maybe 8 fail, 1 company returns the entire fund. It's similar, that's how corporates should invest in technology. Invest in 10, maybe 1, that becomes transformative. There's examples of that done really well. On that particular point, you need to have kind of a really good relationship between humans and machines in terms of the data you use. You need to make sure it's fully verified. You need to know where its origins are. You need to be able to audit it. You need to be able to assign confidence scores to it. You need to be able to separate public and private data. So a large part of our costs as a technology company is these types of processes. That means we can actually trust the underlying data that's going into the artificial intelligence algorithms. And that's because we take data from many different places. Some of it's from websites, some of it's from satellite information, some of it's from insurance companies, and we need to make sure we're fully aware and transparent on the types of data that are influencing the algorithms to, for example, say one risk has a higher loss cost than another risk, and that's the type of process we need. But it's definitely, it's probably an area that isn't well understood by people starting companies. That is a massive architectonic to producing trustable outcomes from
Okay,
technology.
and this leads nicely on to you, Richard. Can I ask at the back, can we have the clock back on the screens in front of us? Because we've been going so well, and I'd hate for Richard to go on for half an hour and we all miss lunch. So this is Richard Hartley, then co-founder and CEO of Cytora, who I believe a lot of the people in this room may use without even knowing it. Mm-hmm. It's an artificial intelligence company that enables commercial insurers to achieve improved loss ratios while delivering fairer prices to customers. TM. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks. So Cytora helps commercial insurers target, select, and price risk. And we do this by using artificial intelligence to gather huge amounts of information from publicly available sources. Some of these are company websites, some of it's satellite information, some of it's government data, some of it's internal company data. We bring all of this data together, and we can differentiate commercial risk in a more granular way and allow commercial insurers to select and price it more accurately. This is kind of valuable because it helps insurance companies become more profitable by assigning a more adequate risk price to a given risk. It also really helps businesses get fairer prices and prices that are more aligned with the actual profile of the risk they're looking to insure. What is the case today is risks are not differentiated very well. So risks that are quite different are often given the same price. And that's kind of suboptimal for society across a range of different dimensions. What I want to touch on here is what are the kind of, I guess, the core benefits of artificial intelligence for commercial insurance? Secondly, what are the limitations? So where are the areas maybe that the performance is not there? and where it won't implicate the status quo. And lastly, how will artificial intelligence drive the future of both risk transfer and insurance in the commercial space? So in terms of benefits, I've touched on the core one already. It helps kind of differentiate risk in a more granular way, leading to fairer prices for businesses, but more accurate pricing and selection for commercial insurers. Secondly, it can remove a lot of the friction out of the process of buying insurance for a small business that might be doing it direct, in terms of they might be going online and buying SME insurance. Or for a more larger business, it makes it easier for a broker to place business with an insurance company. Right now, this is very hard to do. It's very slow. It requires a huge amount of information to be passed from the risk manager to the broker, from the broker to the insurance company, which introduces a lot of cost into the whole process of insurance. I think the value chain is around 8 parties generally, from the person seeking to buy insurance to the reinsurer who's looking to reinsure it. And for every £1 of premium that's provided, about 40 pence of that is lost via cost. It's 40% of that is just needed to actually undertake the insurance transaction, which means insurance as an industry is very unprofitable relative to other industries. And that's obviously negative for the company, because they have to pay a higher insurance premium. They have to pay more money for a unit of insurance. That's what we're looking to change by making insurance as easy, buying insurance as easy as buying a book or getting a taxi on Uber. That's kind of our vision as a company. The third aspect I want to emphasize is a big benefit is AI is helping the insurance industry transfer new types of risks and help ensure the world in new areas of innovation that currently are kind of at the forefront of the economy. You can think about kind of social networking or reputation as one of these, or cyber, identity, intangible risk. All of these things are embodied by data economies. They all emit data in huge amounts, and this type of data can be best priced using algorithms and artificial intelligence rather than using human judgment. Human judgment is extremely good for areas of kind of uncertainty where there isn't much data, and judgment is called for, and the ability to make decisions in uncertainty is paramount. Where there is data, where you have a huge amount of data around what people are doing, what companies are doing, algorithms generally perform better from an underwriting point of view there, and that's kind of what we've shown in the space so far. Now moving on to where I see the limitations, or maybe the reasons why AI won't become a transformative revolution. I think a big one I've just touched on. It's better for standardized and homogeneous risks, where there are many repetitious events happening again and again and again. In these types of things, you have a lot of data, and the performance of the predictions is better than generally what a human can do. And that's why in SME commercial insurance, that's where we see the adoption of artificial intelligence used in underwriting. Not so much in large commercial lines, where maybe the risk manager of Walmart is looking to buy insurance globally. AI will have a lesser impact in that particular space in the short term. And I think it is pretty fair to say we are in a kind of interregnum period of where the companies that will kind of find the best performance is who get the optimal balance between human judgment and machine intelligence, and understanding that as a reciprocal process, where judgment is good in areas of uncertainty where data is poor, machine intelligence is good in areas where the data is rich and events are very repetitious. It comes back to the distinction Frank Knight made between risk and uncertainty. And lastly, just to finish, I think the future of this world we live in is technology. All new innovation in the innovation economy is underpinned by technology emitting data. Therefore, if the insurance industry wants to be prominent and wants to be responsible for new GDP growth, it has to find a way to offset or transfer this risk at the point of the frontier, and is not doing that today. That's why the CEO of Axel Catlin is so critical of the industry, because he sees it as not responsible or not generative to new GDP growth since the turn of the century. And that's probably the thing I'd end on saying. It's really important that the insurance industry becomes a proponent of this new way to price risk.
Okay, Richard, thank you. Yvette made the point, life insurance in 5 minutes. You're talking about making this a lot easier, almost as easy as ordering a taxi. But is this something, risk insurance, is this something that we want to be that easy? Or should it always be more considered? I want to clarify and get the opinion of the panel on how much AI is involved, and actually how involved this really needs to still be.
Definitely. So I think there's a key point here is there's a certain subset of society we live in, loosely millennials. You want to get insurance quickly. Like, purchases should be quick. It should take 5 minutes to buy insurance, not 1 day. And also,
even at a commercial level, even at the commercial level.
I'm talking very much in SME insurance. So if I'm I'm a CEO of a 10-person company, I want to buy insurance very quickly. I also want to get a fair price, but it's important to me that buying insurance is equivalent to getting a taxi, or equivalent to getting a book, or equivalent to using Deliveroo, because that's just my cognition as an individual. It is important to qualify. If I'm the chief risk officer of Walmart, I do not care about speed. I care about trust that the claim will be made, and I care about the accuracy of the price, and a whole different strata of cost economics comes into my cognition. So that's my point. It is there is a separation to be made between what's called SME insurance and large commercial. They're two different worlds.
I could see Tim disagreeing with
yeah,
that.
I mean, I do think insurance and certain financial transactions are different. I'm not an expert in consumer protection law, but I think when you buy something that quickly, which has such a potential impact on you, you need a cooling off period of some kind. You may buy it quickly, but then you must have the right to renege, if you like, after a week or whatever it is, and the systems must allow for that. I mean, otherwise, I think you lose consumer trust in those circumstances, whether or not there is specific regulation.
I would also say, from my point of view, I want to bring Jamie in here as well. There are ways, when you know that everything is automated, you can start to see companies game the system a bit. With cookies on your machine, you get a different price for an item depending on what websites you've been to before. And I wanted your thoughts on when we go more automated, when we're assessing risk and then pricing risk, are there dangers there?
I mean, there's definitely dangers in terms of consumers being treated unfairly. And I think that's why having an ethical basis for the application of these technologies and being able to demonstrate that to consumers and therefore build that trust at that level. And I think anyone, if they feel that they're not going to buy from someone they think is fundamentally cheating them, not in the long term. So I think getting the ethics right, it's back to your Facebook point, getting that right is essential in terms of the long-term health of any digital-based business.
Can I flag another risk? I mean, because we were speaking a lot of the commercial behavioral risk. There is a systemic risk that is not fully understood, which is basically more and more companies from insurer, financial services are drawing their conclusions based on AI or whatever we want to say on the same data set. So risk is becoming endogenous, which is an academic way to put it, to say that these industries are converging, but if you have the assumption that insurance should insure you against something, and actually insurance is very dependent on the same forces on which you are trying to insure against, you are basically compounding risk instead of disentangling. This is something very subtle, systemic, which is perhaps even more fundamental than the behavioral cost that we are facing in the commercial side of the equation.
Okay. I'm going to move to some of the questions that have been coming in that would be more general. I just want to throw to you guys. Does the Road to Revolution report mean that every large company board has to have a dedicated risk director? Who wants to yes or no that?
The question is level, I suspect, isn't it? I certainly think that they, the boards that I'm on look at risk register, look at risk deep dives, look at risk on a basis that they look at it virtually at every meeting, actually.
Yvette?
Well, I think if they don't, which would be unfortunate, then I'm going to reference what I call the rise of the CISO. So the person that will then be responsible for reporting risk is very likely to be your Chief Information Security Officer, who will be talking about technology risk and the information security posture of the business, and then begin to pick up a lot of other risks associated with that by virtue of these correlated relationships. So I think that there is certainly an argument to be made, and certainly under regulatory frameworks it's mandated. But in the absence of it being mandated, I would hope that many boards were interested in having some individual or group of individuals exclusively focused on capturing, managing, and reporting on risk in the business.
And can I expand on that question? I've never been on a board. It sounds frightfully dull to me, but very well paid. And I can imagine the type of person that has made it to that board and their demographic. Are we suggesting that someone on that board needs to be younger, more technical, and just not of the, we all get older. Stuff's changing that I don't understand these days. So are we suggesting that our boards need to be composed of different people?
So I'll give a very quick answer. It depends. And here's why. If you're in front of a technology company board, they're exactly that. And so that's the pro. What's the con? The con is that they don't understand why everybody doesn't speak the language of technology, because they're all quite fluent in it. Then if you're working with perhaps an older board, you might have a lot of wisdom in the room, an ability to think strategically and globally in a way that some of the emerging tech companies and those younger boards haven't quite achieved yet. That's the pro. What's the con? They'll ask you to define cyber.
Yes, Jamie.
I mean, my comment is, what matters is where is a board, particularly the chairman, getting assurance from. And if they've got that expertise on the board, great. If they haven't, then they need to know where they're getting it from. So every company is going to be different. Where is your assurance coming from? If it's on the board, great. If it's not, where are you going to get it from?
In the future, I don't think you're going to, as a CEO, going to be able to delegate too much, frankly, in this area. I reckon that a CEO really does have to have some understanding, because the impact of technology is so great. I mean, you take the Internet of Things, you take blockchain, you take AI, you take cybersecurity, you add all those things together, and the impact on the company is huge in whatever business you are, basically.
I just wonder whether the reality is that by the time you get to C-level, you are of an age and seniority, you have the wisdom, but almost necessarily you've lost touch with what's happening at the very bottom level. I mean, I know
I think, the point is that, first of all, everything is shifting. So it's a co-evolution. I mean, boards, the environment, we learn. So what was crazy 5 years ago becomes the baseline now. So there's a co-evolution of different stakeholders. The point is that, technology becomes the company. It's like electricity. Now, we don't have a chief electricity officer or a chief water officer.
Exactly.
It's obvious. It's everywhere. So that will become, in a few years, it will become so much embedded that we will not have this panel anymore. It will be a new revolution, a new discontinuity. But in this transition, it is very important that the chairman understand that things will come from different directions. And his legacy or her legacy knowledge may not apply in this world in which technology is the company. That's the point.
Precisely.
Technology is the company. That's the key line.
And I may say, if the House of Lords can do a report on AI, then frankly, there's hope for every chief executive.
Okay, well, there's a strap line. Let's move on. Gareth, thank you for your question. I like this one. Creating a more diverse workforce is a laudable aspiration, but how can one do so within insurance, which is typically seen as mundane and dry?
It's really, really hard. I mean, this is the thing I think that's probably been most readily expressed to me as, running a company outside the insurance industry is insurers want to work with us because they can't attract the equivalent talent inside their own organizations. And it's, precisely the question is how do you influence someone that could go and work for Google or go and work for Amazon to go and work for a large, quite nebulous insurance company, surrounded by someone who, many people who've been actuaries and underwriters for 40 years. That is not an interesting place for that person to work, generally. I think there are exceptions, but if you're coming out and thinking, I'm going to change the world, and I've been kind of coding in my bedroom, I've built all of these programs, and then you go and you look at the world of insurance, it's almost like the worst place to be, because it's very manual, it's very traditional, it's very pyramidal. The people there are not technologists, so most CEOs of insurance companies have very limited understanding of technology, and that's why they struggle to attract these talent bases. And I think it can be solved to a degree, but it's not easily solved. And I'm speaking from speaking to chief science officers of insurance companies. It's their biggest problem, how to get top talent into insurers.
Jamie.
I was just going to say, I'm fairly new to this game. I spent 29 years doing policing and intelligence and foreign policy and diplomacy. I think insurance is actually incredibly fascinating. So I think there's something about, there's something about communicating how relevant it is to strategy, because none of this innovation, none of this growth is going to happen if there aren't people like the folks in this room actually supporting that and enabling it and giving people the confidence to take what is otherwise a complete leap into the unknown. So it's our time has come.
The geek shall inherit the earth, yes.
Just on that point, it definitely is an intensely fascinating subject, and that's what's really surprised me. But that's not the experience of people going into insurance, because you can think conceptually, probability, psychology, conceptually it's such a fertile area. But if I, or people who work for equivalent companies such as Lemonade, if they were going to go and work for a top 20 insurance company, you're sitting there surrounded by people who aren't like you, and you're involved in processes that are bureaucratic, and that's the emotional response. I don't think it's a response about conceptually it's not interesting. I think just the experience is not interesting, and there's a need to transform that.
We'll go to Yvette. We've just got time for one more question, so we'll Yvette and Gianvito, and then one more question. Yvette first.
I was just going to say quickly, I'll turn it right over to you, that I think that there's a terrific example in what the financial institutions have done. So JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon came out for years and said, to hell with blockchain, right? We don't want anything to do with it. It's famous comments around this. And then some of the guys related to him, working for him, said, well, why don't we skunkworks that, right? Why don't we set up this little blockchain thing? And they had a really smart gal named Andrea Cadnet come in and run it, right? Pulled her right off the street, kept purple hair, tattoos and all, threw her in JP Morgan. And what happened? She built the entire JP Morgan blockchain methodology. She recently left the firm. And arguably, she's transforming it through the use of smart contracts and other things they're going to do with that. So whether you agree with that technology or not, my point is that there are ways, I think, within insurance companies to look at that as a model. Let's skunkwork something. Let's play around with something.
It's
Let's
having
see where
some
it goes.
startups within your big business.
Sure.
Disruption. You need some disruption in there. Yeah.
And I think there's a paradox here. So nobody's saying that insurance will disappear. The problem, disruption here, is not related to the disappearance of the industry. Actually, we will have it like we have content, like we have entertainment, is that the business model, the way in which insurance will be done will be completely different. So that's, I think, the wake-up call that this report and this panel, I think, is giving, is we need insurance, period. That's unquestionable. But the way in which we will be doing our insurance products will be completely different. And that's why we need diversity, all the other things that we've been discussing.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I'd like just a brief answer from each of you. It's the top question on here. Digital sums it all up. Digital developments are moving faster than businesses' ability to keep up. How can AMEC members stay up to speed? So, that's as general as you'd like it to be. And Gianvito, I'm going to start with you because you did the report.
I mean, I think they're referring to, we don't have it anymore, it's a personal transformation. Now, going from the macro to the firm level to the organizational, we need to constantly reinvent ourselves. That takes training. It's hard. It's very hard.
Okay,
it's a personal transformation. It's keep calm and reinvent yourself.
No, so easy. Jamie.
Read the AMIC documents and watch Click on the TV.
Wow.
That's very practical, yeah.
Favourite participant.
Well, of course, I'd suggest reading the House of Lords report, all 181 pages. But I think Gianvito's got the right solution, really, because there is no substitution for you taking the interest in it and trying to understand the risks that are involved. And if you don't understand, how can you expect your colleagues in the organization to understand?
Thank you, Yvette.
Okay, mine's going to be a little different. Here's what I would suggest as a homework assignment from us to you. Look at your revenue forecast for your business over the next 12 months. Think about the 3 top risks in technology that might be facing your business that would impact revenue. Could be a product-based risk, could be a coding-based risk, whatever it is. Then go to YouTube and go in and open up YouTube and type in hack whatever the risk is. Just type it in, all right? And you're gonna see a whole bunch of videos come up on people that are absolutely decomposing what it is that you're trying to protect. Guarantee it. Now watch that and then say, okay, game on. How do I wanna think about this? And that is the quickest way for you to learn the terminology because it'll be relevant to your business, because you'll understand it in the context of your product, and for you to actually see how the risk is being motivated against what it is that you're thinking about lifetime. And I guarantee you that kind of information is pervasive, and there's a boatload of it.
Brilliant, thank you. Finally, Richard.
Yeah, I think to kind of build on the other themes, I think it's about being open to educating yourself about these new concepts and ideas and technologies that you probably don't know today, or maybe you do know, but they're quite nebulous because they're just kind of ideas or things that are hyped. I think also make sure, try and surround yourself with people that are deeply fluent and can educate and help you reason about the validity of using or investing in one versus not. I think it's kind of, if you have all the information, you can generally make a good decision. Often bad decisions come where you only have the partial set of information. So I think it's, building on the other points, I think that's the key here.
Okay. Could you thank our panel, please, because they were brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. Really, really good. And I hope that format works as well. It is a bit of a cliche, isn't it? Change is coming, change is here. But it really is coming, and it's scary, and it's crazy. And we are becoming more immediate, and social media is affecting the public discourse. And if you need proof of how fast things can change at the highest level of governance, look at what happened yesterday in the G7. Look what's going to happen tomorrow in Singapore. I mean, and let's not forget that the use of big data, social media, and general dissatisfaction with the way that things are gave us people like Trump and gave us things like Brexit in the first place. Trump might be a one-off.
That's a whole nother discussion.
It's a whole other discussion.
The tweeting president.
The tweeting president. But I have a feeling once he's gone, we're not going to go all the way back to how we were before. So thank you very much for listening. I'd like to invite Julia back to give her thoughts about what we've all heard. So Julia.
Or do we sit?
Spencer, thanks very much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed. What a brilliant way to start our conference. Fantastic panel. Spencer, before you disappear, I'm looking. Great moderation. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, thanks.
And thank you very much to everybody in the audience, because we were looking at the questions coming in. The volume and the quality of those questions has been staggering. And I'm just sorry that we couldn't take all of them, because we could only take a relatively small percentage. But it's given us some really good food for thought as to what we might do next in ERMIC in terms of technical and educational agendas. So thank you to you as well. Heard the word trust mentioned quite a lot. So you can revolutionize the world, but there are some things that you cannot undermine. And I think quality, service, and trust are definitely three of those. Personal reinvention. I thought the final words and the challenge from Yvette were brilliant. And we should take away her advice. But I'd add another word to that, and we didn't have the opportunity to talk as much as perhaps we'd like, and that is the importance of collaboration between our peers, between those we work for, between the people in our teams. This is a subject that's going to go on and have a lot of open discussion about how we develop. And governance and risk management, absolutely key in the future of this subject, but that personal reinvention of we, our members and our partners, is absolutely key to being able to develop what in effect is the new finance in the way that organisations are managed. And I heard what was crazy 5 years ago is embedded today. And I guess when we come back to this conference in a year or two, we'll be saying what was crazy 2 years ago was embedded today, because the revolution is with us, but the pace of change is ever quickening. And we need to think about challenges and ways that we can keep up with that change of pace. So great start, lots of things to think about at this week and beyond. I'd now like to make sure that you now all head to your workshops. You should know which ones you've signed up for. They're due to start at 2:15, so if you can make your way to the workshops that you have registered for, and we wish you a really great workshop and, of course, the rest of this conference. Thank you.